Okay, so now we also know how to work with our API routes inside of getStaticProps. We don't send a request there, we just execute the code directly in getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. Now let's talk about dynamic API routes. What's that? Well, let's say you don't just want to have /API/feedback, which handles post and get requests, but you also want to support /API/feedback/some feedback ID to just fetch the single piece of data for that specific feedback item. Because maybe you need that somewhere on your page. For example, on the feedback page, you could say that for every list item you're rendering here, you also have like a show details button. And when that button is clicked, you want to show the details for that feedback item. And hence you want to fetch the data, the full data for that feedback item. Now we are, of course, actually fetching the full feedback data here. And we could just use client-side JavaScript to use that already loaded data for that. But let's assume that we're not fetching the full data here, but that instead we are only getting the ID and the text and not the email address. And therefore, when this button is clicked, we want to fetch the full data again, but not for all feedback items, but for this single feedback item. And that's what you could use a dynamic API route for. Because we already know dynamic pages, where you create a page with that square bracket notation like this. This would then allow for a request sent to /feedback/some ID, and some ID would be interpreted as a value for this ID placeholder. And you could then use it inside of that page component and so on. That's what we already learned before. Now that's for regular pages. We can use a similar feature for API routes, because it's also not unrealistic that we want to send a request to /API/feedback and then the ID of a specific feedback to then load the data for that specific feedback. And for this, we need a new file, because here in feedback.js, we only handle requests to /API/feedback/nothing. Hence, in the API folder, we can add a dynamic API route, and we do that in exactly the same way as we do it for regular pages. We use square brackets and then any placeholder name of our choice, like for example ID or feedback ID or whatever you want. And I'll go with feedback ID. So now we have a dynamic API route file. In there, we still define our handler function and we still export that. So just as in the other file, because it works in exactly the same way. This API route works in exactly the same way, it's just dynamic. So for dynamic path segments. So therefore in here, we might now want to fetch the data for a specific piece of feedback. And for that, of course, we need to know which concrete value was encoded in the URL as a value for this placeholder. And we can get access to that again through this request object, which we should accept together with that response object. And there we learned that we have body for accessing the submitted data, method for finding out which kind of request it was, and we also have query for getting access to query parameters and regular parameters. So we can get access and get our feedback ID by accessing rec.query.feedbackID. .feedbackID because I encoded feedback ID between the square brackets here in my file name. So that gives us access to the concrete feedback ID that was part of the URL when that request hit that handler. And now we can use that feedback ID to retrieve a specific feedback item from the feedback JSON file. For this, I still want to get access to that file. So I will still import my two functions from that other file here. So from the feedback.js file, the build feedback path and the extract feedback functions. Again, we could outsource them in some global helpers file if we wanted to. And then I'll construct my file path by calling build feedback path and get my feedback data by calling extract feedback and passing file path as an argument. Now feedback data is then an array of all items, and now here I just want to get all the data for one specific item. So since this is an array, we can of course just call feedback data.find to find one single item, which then executes a function on every item to find out whether that is the item we're looking for or not. And the item we're looking for is the item where feedback.id is equal to feedback ID. So that is then the selected feedback, and that's the kind of data we now want to send back with that 4 incoming requests. And for this we use the response object, set a status of 200, and set our JSON response body data, which could carry an items key, which is an object here where I set the feedback key, let's say, to selected feedback. And now that would return a feedback for a selected ID. Now, just to make that crystal clear, your dynamic API routes cannot just handle GET requests. Here I'm not checking the request method at all, which means that for all incoming requests, I'm just sending back this JSON data. But we could also check the request method here and do something different for post requests if we needed to. For example, you could check for delete requests, and if a delete request is sent for a specific feedback ID, you could execute some code that deletes that feedback from our stored feedback items. It's not a functionality I need here, but it is something you could also build. So dynamic routes work for all request methods, put, post, delete, get, and so on, and you can of course differentiate what you do inside of your handler function with if checks. Here I just want to return my selected feedback no matter which method was used though, and therefore that's the code we can use. Now we added this API route, now we can use it in our feedback page. Here, when this button is clicked, I want to send a request to this dynamic API route to fetch the details for a single feedback. And for this, in the feedback page component, we can add a function, load feedback handler, or whatever you want to call it. And then in here, send a request. So now let's connect load feedback handler to this button with onClick. And in load feedback handler, we now need to know for which ID to load the feedback. So we expect ID as a parameter. And to make sure that this ID is passed in, when we bind our load feedback handler to the onClick prop, when we pass it into onClick, I'll call bind on that function, which is a built-in JavaScript method to pre-configure this function for future execution. If it's not clear how bind works, attached you find an additional resource on that which clarifies it. Bind in the end allows us to pre-configure this function, so it does not execute the function yet, but it pre-configures it for future execution. And it, for example, allows us to pre-configure parameter values that will be received here. Now, the first value, the first argument we pass to bind is a value for the this keyword inside of this function. We don't care about that here, so we can set this to null. And then the second value we pass to bind will be the value for the first argument, the first parameter received by that function. And here that should be item.id, so that this button, when it's clicked, for this function execution uses the ID of the item we're currently rendering. So that's then the value which we receive here, and then we can use the fetch function to again send a request. Send a request to /API/ and then the feedback ID, so we add ID to that path. Or we build that with the template literal notation with backticks, and send this to /API/ and inject ID like this. Either way, this produces a URL like /API/ some feedback ID, and that will then trigger this dynamic route. Now we're still working with promises here, so we'll then still add a then block to get our response eventually and parse that data. We could also add error handling here, but I'll not do it here to keep this shorter. And then we got this data, which we can use in this second then block. Now here we might want to render the details. So again, we can use state for this to update our component and what's rendered once we got the data. So from React, I'll import use state here and then set up some state for this component. The feedback data, let's say, with the set feedback data state updating function, where we call use state. And initially that's undefined. We have no starting value. But in this then block, once we have the data fetched from our API, we can call set feedback data to set data.feedback like this as our new state. Now data.feedback, because in this dynamic API route, I'm setting a feedback property in that response object. So that is the property holding the selected feedback data. So that full feedback object fetched from feedback JSON. And therefore it's this property named feedback, which I want to access here in my frontend code as well as my feedback data. That is then that object fetched from feedback JSON, which I set as my feedback data here. Now when that's called, the component will be re-evaluated because the state changed. And we can utilize this to output the email address for this feedback. So when that button was clicked, we now want to show the email address. And since I always just have feedback data for one specific feedback loaded, the way my component is designed here, I'll do this above the unordered list, use fragment, import it from React, because adjacent JSX code isn't allowed otherwise, move that in here, and then here render something conditionally. If feedback data is set, then I want to output, let's say, a paragraph where I just output feedback data.email. The .email, because feedback data will be a single piece of data from feedback JSON, so such an object. And in those objects, we do have an email property. So we can access that here. And then we'll show up the data for the loaded feedback for a single piece of feedback above the list of feedbacks. Now that is of course all just some very basic unstyled dummy code to show you how you can interact with those API routes. Hence, if we now save everything and reload /feedback, we do have the show details button. And if we click it, we see eventually the email address of that feedback shows up at the top. Now, as mentioned before, this is kind of redundant, because with getStaticProps, we already fetch the full feedback data. So we have all that data exposed through props in that component already. So sending another request for a single piece of data here is redundant. But of course, it's not redundant for you to know about this dynamic API route feature, which is why I used this example for showing this to you. Because this is how you can send requests to dynamic API routes and how you can set up dynamic API routes to execute server-side code for dynamic pieces of data encoded in the path.